me at Cello, Cello. You had me at Cello. You had me at Cello. Oh, you had me at Cello. Afternoon, everybody. Time for another episode of Cello Chat. Today, I get to talk with George Kennaway, a cellist and also a conductor and a musicologist extraordinaire. So, George, this is very exciting for me, but first of all, how are you doing?
I'm very well, and I'm very pleased to have a chance to talk to you about all these things. Yeah.
Tremendous, tremendous. Well, I'm dying to ask you about a number of these things about cello playing, for example, performance practice that so many of us just take for granted. But the first question I like to ask is, how did you get where you are? How did you even get started on the
Mhm.
cello in the first place? And a little bit about your educational background.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, this could take a little while, but I hope you can bear with it.
Yeah.
So I come from Edinburgh in Scotland, and I grew up there. I was at school there till, I left school. Um, and I play the cello because um, at my primary school, where in Scotland you go till age 12. Um, I took a letter home one day saying your child could have cello lessons. And my parents are both musical, and my father was a professional musician. And they said, yes, this is fine. But the deal was, and this will seem extraordinary, it's like something out of another world now. You got free cello lessons, first of all, in school time and every day. So I had a half-hour cello lesson every day, free. My parents bought my music, but actually that would have been given to me free as well if I wanted it.
Hmm.
And it was a group lesson, as you know, I'm sure people listening will understand. It was a group lesson, but all the other people dropped out. So I had an excellent teacher for the best part of about three, maybe more than 3 years. And every day I would get up and walk out of the class and go to my cello lesson. And this system carried on in Edinburgh until the late 1980s. I know because I know a teacher who worked there. And he was an excellent teacher, a man called Herman Mitchell. I think almost completely forgotten now, but he was absolutely first class. And many, many years later, when I played for an opera company, his widow came to the performances because she saw my name on the orchestra list. So that's how I got. And then at secondary school, I had one or two different teachers, but then I had a very well-known teacher in Scotland called Mari Dare, who composed some beautiful pieces for the cello, some very easy, some quite sophisticated. And I had lessons with her for most of my time at secondary school until I left school at 18. And then I had a choice. I had to decide if I took my golf clubs to university or my cello. Um, and I think I made the right choice because I would never earn a living playing golf. Let's put it that way. And I had a wonderful old lady teacher in Newcastle called Valentine Ord, who is still remembered in that part of the world, in Newcastle. That's in the far north of England. And then I went to Oxford and had lessons with Michael Edmonds, who was a very good local teacher. And then I went to Christopher Bunting. And I carried on with Bunting when I was a postgraduate at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London. So that's that's the short version.
All right. And at what point did the musicological side of things
Yeah.
evolve?
Yeah. Well, I went to Newcastle University in the north of England to read English, and I did English with music. I spent all my time in the music department. And I went to Oxford to write a PhD on aspects of music and words in the 17th century, but I played the cello all the time. I was actually even president of the Oxford University Musical Club for a year. I played the cello all the time. I wrote some research. I didn't know what I was doing. Long story short, I freelanced with the Scottish Chamber Orchestra. Then I became co-principal cello in the Orchestra of Opera North, which was a relatively new opera company at that time, formed in the late 1970s. And I stayed there for about 28 years. But around the year 2000, and cellists will understand what I'm saying particularly, a large part of the repertoire of any opera company at all is Rossini, Bellini, Donizetti. The cello parts for these operas are not very challenging, let's put it that way. And I suddenly thought, my goodness, I could be playing this stuff for another 20 years. Can I really face it? And I felt guilty because my Oxford thing had never produced anything, any result. So I went as a postgraduate to Leeds University to do a master's part-time while I was still playing in the orchestra. And I switched up from that to a PhD straight away. I got the master's. And I love writing. That's basically the thing I like doing. I love writing. Um, I don't claim any particular virtue in the work I do, but no one else has done it. So, I cling to that. That produces some royalties. Um, so, yeah, I went back to university largely to kind of lay a ghost from 30 years earlier. And then it turned into a full-time occupation. I got a postdoc position at Leeds University, working on a very important project in 19th century performance practice. And the rest is history, basically.
Excellent, excellent. All right. So let's see. There's so much to cover about the musicological research, but I also want to ask your passion and commitment to the cello, this variety of excellent cello teachers that you've had. Are there certain things from any of them that just every time you get the cello out of the case, stay at the forefront of your mind?
Yeah. I was lucky. My first teachers, Maury Dare, particularly, and Valentine Ord, were both quite old ladies. Uh, Valentine Ord was over 80 years old, actually, when she was teaching me. She was a pupil of Klengel. Wow. Back in the day. Maury Dare was a pupil of, I've forgotten her English teacher, someone very famous. It escapes me from it. But then she went to study at the Paris Conservatoire with Paul Basilaire. And she told me a story about stamina, which I never forgot. She had to play the Saint-Saëns minor concerto in Budapest in the 1920s. She'd learned it, but she didn't have time to practice it much. So the train in those days from Paris to Budapest took 2 days, and she practiced it on the train. And she told me she got off the train, I went to her rehearsal, and it was all fine. And I thought, that's impressive, and I'm working on that with a former pupil of mine who's coming to me for coaching on that piece right now. And I immediately told her that story, you have to be able to just get off the train and do it, And that's what Christopher Bunting also said. He said, you had to have a performance that you could give under the most terrible conditions. You're ill, you've missed the rehearsal, you've not had time to eat, all the usual kind of things that we're familiar with. And I saw him play like that in St. John Smith Square in London. He played a recital program that included the Poulenc Sonata, which I have played a couple of times. Very delicate, refined, complex, technically challenging piece. And he played it. And afterwards, I realized he had a temperature of about 104 degrees Fahrenheit. And I couldn't believe it. But the thing that Bunting was so good at was teaching you how to analyze technical problems. That was his thing. He said once that he thought most people knew how they thought the music should go. And his job was to kind of sort of help them do that. He didn't sit down and tell you this is how to play Bach or this is how to play Beethoven or whatever, but he did give you technical ability to analyze problems. And that remained with me. I don't teach very much nowadays, but that remained with me right through my own teaching. I use a lot of his ideas over and over again. And but in the orchestra where I played at Opera North, sometimes people said I had a bit of an old lady-ish vibrato. And I took that as a compliment because I did learn with two old ladies, and I still have quite a relaxed vibrato. Let's put it that way. I'm not. I don't try to sound like Misha Maisky, for instance. It's not electric and terribly wide. So yeah, so those things really do stay with you.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think Bunting was incredibly bright and very, very perceptive.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. And then
Yeah, absolutely.
go ahead.
Well, yeah, even this sounds so silly, but the thing that was called his bow regime, you set the metronome to 100. You do 8 clicks per note, and then you vary it up and down, and then you practice completely artificial dynamics. 2 bars loud, 2 beats loud, sorry, 2 beats quiet. Practice a crescendo, up bow and down bow. With no music at all, just effects. And that was, at that time for me, that was absolutely, influential. It was great that you could just break things down and then decide what you want to do.
Yeah, that's great. And then you have conducting in your wheelhouse, your chops as well. How did that come about?
Purely by chance. And I think for quite a lot of professional musicians, suddenly they're in a situation for any reason at all, they have to conduct a group of some kind. And the cello section I was playing in at Opera North at that time, I was co-principal, and the section principal wanted to put on a concert of cello ensemble pieces. And we thought, okay. There were some mixed feelings about this, I have to say. I'm not being indiscreet when I say that, and it was a long time ago. But at one point, it was clear she wanted to do the Villa-Lobos Bachanas Brasileiras with soprano. And I thought, oh, really? I'm not sure I'm comfortable with this for various reasons that I won't go into. I said, I'm sorry, but I really don't think I don't think I'm comfortable with this. So she came back to me the next day and said, I think we need someone to conduct it. And I thought, oh, actually, that's an interesting idea. And I went out and bought myself a little white stick. And, I had no technique at all. But I discovered that I could deal with singers. The singer was excellent on this occasion. It was absolutely her repertoire. She knew it inside out. But because she knew it inside out, she was doing a lot of things that were very flexible and needed to be, accommodated. And I discovered that I could work with a singer and that I had a better ear than I thought I had, which took me a little by surprise. I suddenly realized, oh, there's a note missing. And people said, oh, really? You do have an ear. And then an amateur orchestra, a community orchestra near me, were looking for a new conductor. And I thought, okay, I'll have a go at this. And I turned up and tried something, and I conducted a concert with them, and they gave me the job. But at the end of that concert, Brahms Violin Concerto, Sibelius First Symphony, Beethoven Overture, I was more exhausted than I had been after playing, I don't know, a 4.5 hour long opera. I could play a 4 hour opera, get up, go home, no problem. But this conducting, I was completely exhausted. And I thought the next day, there's something wrong here. It shouldn't be like this. And so I looked around and I started going to a great conducting teacher who died just a few years ago, George Hurst, a terrific conductor. quite an individual kind of person with his own particular obsessions, but uh, a brilliant teacher. And I did his master classes each summer for 3 years, and I could conduct without being exhausted with an actual technique. And that's what I liked, because just like Bunting really taught a technique, so did George Hurst. And then I could conduct an entire concert and be perfectly happy, you know. The band, I mean, obviously, you're moving quite a lot, but, not a stretcher case, not just collapsing on the sofa when I got home, So that made a huge difference. And I still like doing that. I, I conducted a couple of community orchestras, quite good chamber orchestras, for 7 or 8 years. Um, and then I decided that orchestras shouldn't have a conductor for longer than that. They should have a change. And I decided I was too busy with other things, so I stopped doing it. But I still stand in for my colleagues if they need a night off or something like that, which is quite fun. Yeah.
Excellent, excellent. All right. So his musicological research, I think you're quite prolific. There are quite a number of things that, even if they don't have cello in the title, that still are very much of interest to me as a cellist. But I think the main thing I'd like to start with is your book on the cello from 1780 to 1930, which is a huge and incredibly dynamic and important swath of time. So I think it's very easy. It's very easy for cellists, young cellists, I think in particular, to think, oh, okay, so here's this instrument I have in my hands, and okay, so you move the bow like this, and you do this with your left hand and everything. And every so often you're hit with another name. Who's that person? Oh, they lived a long time ago. But the evolution of playing the cello is just this fascinating story that it's so easy to just take for granted. So, I mean, I know that to go blow by blow through the book would take longer than we have, but I'm certainly interested, like what led to it in the first place, and for all the people watching, what do you think are some of the reasons why, as either a cello player or somebody who just loves listening to cello music, that it's so valuable to understand this context?
Yeah, how it came about is there are two kind of stimuli for that. When I decided to do a PhD at Leeds University with Professor Clive Brown, who is he's now retired from Leeds, and he's guest professor in Vienna now. And Clive Brown actually pretty much created the whole discipline of historical performance practice in that period. Not Baroque music so much, but late classical, romantic, post-romantic period. And he was at Leeds. So I signed up to do a PhD with him. First of all, my topic was simply Bach cello suites in the 19th century. Editions, performances. There are more editions than you think, and there are more performances than you think. But I hit a brick wall after a while. I thought, there isn't a full PhD here. I reckon there's maybe 30,000 words, but there's certainly not 80,000 words, which is what I was planning to do. So I said to Clive one day, I said, what am I going to do? I don't think Bach is a big enough subject for a PhD. I can see how it might be done now, actually, but that's a different question. And he just looked at me and said, why don't you just do the cello in the 19th century? And I took a deep breath and thought, okay. And that's how it turned out. The whole thrust of the book is not to tell you how to play. That's the first thing. But it is, broadly speaking, to show there are possibilities there that you might not consider. If you look at a passage from Beethoven A Major Sonata, Brahms E minor sonata. Um, if you look at that music, there are ways of playing various passages in that sort of music, which are not obvious unless you've looked at the historical sources. And when you realize what extra possibilities there are there, some quite surprising, and certainly you don't have to embrace everything, but there are some ideas out there that are just refreshingly different and worth checking out. That's basically the approach. I strongly resist people who try to dictate how to play. Because I just don't think that's valuable. And it goes actually with a completely outdated model of what we call the work concept. Beethoven's cello sonatas do not exist in some sort of ideal space,
Right.
imperfectly represented by printed music, passed on through imperfect minds, and the poor performer has to struggle up the hill to get to the top, and he'll never get to the top. That it doesn't work like that. People did think like that in the 19th century some of the time.
Mm.
But it's not that. It's a performative concept. So what I do now, there's a great, great British cellist, David Watkin, who died quite recently. It was a friend of mine. Wonderful, wonderful player. And he made what I still think is the best recording of the Bach cello suites on original instruments. And the best thing about it was, for me, and I told him this myself, thank God, I told him that it sounds amazing, David, and he could have done it completely differently the next week. It had that air of, this is how it feels today, you know, and maybe, next year, next month, whatever, it might feel a bit different, and I do it differently, and it would be just as good, but different. So I think that approach to works of art in music is much more valuable than just this endless striving for perfection all the time, which worries me so much in young students. And yeah, also, frankly, for its own sake, it's a kind of history of ideas thing as well. People think differently about the cello, about what it is, about how it is, what it means to play the cello. Some of the ideas circulating around gender, for instance, of the cello, which I only came across almost by chance, um, are really quite stimulating as ideas in themselves. And I quite like that aspect of it as well.
So, if I may, is there, let's see, in this idea of, okay, that we're striving for one perfect interpretation, and once we find it, we're going to play it exactly that way every time,
Yeah.
versus like one of my former teachers, Evan Tonsing, he'd never get to a point where he'd say, yeah, do it exactly like that. He'd always
Yes.
say something like that, meaning
Yes,
you're in
exactly.
you're
Yeah.
in the
Yes.
yeah, the Venn diagram. And
Yes.
I'm wondering, there's, of course, not all symphony conductors are like this by any means, but in my own experience, there have been some times in playing in a symphony when the person on the podium is clearly after this exact way. Don't vary from it. This is exactly how
Yes.
we're going to perform it. And so in our dress rehearsal, we're going to do it exactly the same way that we're going to do it in the performance. Whereas opera playing, when you're in an opera pit, what's the point of really trying to strive for that? Because, oh, okay, the singer took an extra long breath here. You better be
Yeah.
paying attention because it's a
Yeah.
living thing. Do you think
Yeah.
there's possible relationship there in kind of the opera mentality or approach?
I think, yes, I think you've hit on something absolutely correct there. Um, yeah. And the thing is that people at conservatoires typically, not all, but typically will have very little opera experience when they graduate. I mean, they'll have some these days, but as instrumentalists playing a Mozart opera, that there's a whole different ballgame from doing a conventional Mozart symphony program or something like that, because yes, A singer could take an extra long breath. The singer could forget to sing the second verse of the aria, or the singer might sing the same verse twice. Um, there was an early stage in my opera orchestra where we knew the stuff pretty well, and if we heard a singer make some very small slip up on stage, half the orchestra would go with what they heard coming from the stage, and the other half would go with the conductor.
Ooh.
Yeah. And in the end, there had to be a policy decision that no matter what, we would go with the conductor, because then there was a chance things could be sorted out if something had gone wrong. But if half the orchestra does one thing and half the other, then it's hopeless. It just takes ages to sort it all out. But that was quite an interesting stage we went through. Yeah, I think you get the sense with opera that the performance is a really sort of contingent idea. It depends on so many variables. If the stagehand presses the wrong button in the unfamiliar theatre, then the set in Samson and Delilah falls down too early, and that leaves Samson trying to push the columns down that have already fallen around him, which did actually happen once. All sorts of things like that go on. But the more underlying thing is that every time a conductor stands in front of an orchestra or a group of chamber musicians, I've just been coaching chamber music in Wales for 2 weeks. Every time a quartet or a string quartet meets, it's what's happening now that is the important thing. And walking in with a preset design is almost certainly a waste of time. And this goes back to a very influential moment when I was doing English literature at university, because one of my lecturers described research in the humanities, especially sort of literary criticism, that kind of thing. He described it as you write this thing, and at the end, there's an assumption that you say, this is how things are, isn't it? And that question at the end means it's always a conversation, And I think performances are a bit like that. This is how I think this Beethoven quartet goes, I think. What do you think? That kind of stuff, I think it's always provisional, there's no point in thinking about it any other way. No.
That's awesome. Okay, so another question. How do you go about researching how the cello was played? I mean, granted, there are recordings that go back further than some people think, if we get the wax cylinders and everything, but certainly not back to 1780. So how do you go about? I mean, I'm sure you've read copious amounts of original texts on this sort of thing, but then how do you figure out, okay, what are they talking about then? And do I, how would I put myself in that mindset of that time?
Yeah, that is quite tricky. And it doesn't get a lot easier, actually, even if you do have all the old recordings, from, say, acoustic recording period, because even then, the recording process, and we now know this because there's a lot of research done in it now, the recording process is so impermanent. We are accustomed to thinking now that a recording is like a thing you do, and people talk about a definitive recording of this piece or that piece. But back in those days, 1910, 1905, recording wasn't even important for musicians. They'd be asked to go in, they'd walk in, they'd do a maximum of 2 takes, walk out, and not think about it again. And the conditions could vary enormously. If the wax is too hot or too cold, if the horn is not placed in exactly the right place to capture the sound, all that kind of thing. There are so many variables in the pre-electric period, which is basically where I sort of live, that even that needs to be seen as in a much wider context. If you go back beyond recordings, and I don't think recordings can be used to infer older practices further back than maybe 30 or 40 years at the most. But the further back you go, the more you need to be thinking about all sorts of different sources coming from all sorts of different directions. So obviously cello tutors, any number of books, any number of them, how to play the cello, easy lessons for the cello, an introduction to the art of cello playing, all that kind of thing. Those books are obviously central, but you must always be imagining who were they written for, why were they written that way, and what the guy writes and it's always a guy, what the guy writes in the book is for the pupil. It does not mean this is how he played himself. And the difference between theory and practice was something that I came up with very quickly. I would be looking for examples of cello music with printed fingerings. And in the case of Dotzauer, for instance, Julius Dotzauer, you could see that he says in his method, don't do this thing. And in his published music with fingerings, he says, do this thing. It's as simple as that. So what you do yourself, it's not what you tell your pupils to do. I can't help thinking that still sounds quite relevant now. But for that book, for later periods, I used Pathé newsreels. I used magazine articles, newspaper articles, some written by non-specialists, some written by serious music critics, references in novels to people playing the cello and what that suggested the cello sort of symbolized or represented, the ideas connected with it. And you have to come at these things from a whole load of different directions. If you can't, one of my colleagues keeps talking about treatise archaeology, and treatise archaeology is quite a useful thing to do, but it's certainly not the whole story. You must always be looking at a wider cultural context.
Well, now I imagine that you found a wide variety of kind of usefulness, maybe, in terms of the specificity with which some of these tutors described what to do. I mean, I think in the extreme, there are situations like our Sevcik studies where it seems he wrote it to where the notes speak for themselves. You know what I mean? There's just like, if you do this and then this and then this, you'll catch on. But then there's some tutors there's some tutors that go into enormous detail. I think of the Mantell book, for example, on cello technique, where it's just so incredibly precise about the motion starts here and then moves there and then starts to change here. So I'm just curious, without giving too much of a spoiler, my book, unfortunately, it still hasn't arrived. I want everybody to read it, your book. But can you give an example of somebody who was particularly precise in 1780 to 1930 about this is the mechanism?
Actually, yes. I'm just checking with myself that I'm not overlooking something more obvious. But one of the people I came across writing this book was a Scottish musician called John Gunn. And his book about the cello, he wrote 2 editions of it, roughly 10 years apart. And they're quite different. They're not really different in terms of the advice, but the manner of teaching has changed. And I was so intrigued by this. John Gunn is the first person to identify the standard scale fingering that we all use for like a 3-octave scale.
Mm-hmm.
So it's play 3 notes and shift.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically it. Like an E major scale, 1, 2, 4, 1, that kind of thing. But he got there first. People say that it was Dupont, but actually John Gunn got there about 15 years earlier, and he did it by thinking. He starts his cello method, 1789, with about over 50 pages of the history of stringed instruments from the classical period to the present day. And then he starts talking about the physicality of the physics of string vibrations. It takes pages and pages and pages before he finally tells you how to sit down and hold the cello. And he goes into enormous, enormous detail about this. You put your left foot a little bit forward, right foot a little bit back. The cello rests between the legs, held by the corners, not the sides, because you dampen the vibration. Your left arm is in a position like this, and you don't use a violin type left hand with the fingers really sloping backwards enormously. You play like this, like we all do. You hold the bow here. I mean, he goes into endless detail. And the thing about John Gunn is that he did play the cello. He wasn't a famous cellist. He was a music teacher, but I'm not sure how much cello teaching he did. But what he was a thinker. And I wrote a book about him because he was irritating me so much that in the end I decided to write a book about him, which was published in 2022, 21. I wrote it during COVID lockdown in London. I had a publisher's deadline. I thought, right, we can't go out much, we can't do much. I'm just going to sit here and type, and that's what happened. I did 2 things, actually. I practiced Rococo variations because I had a concert coming up as soon as COVID was over, where I had to play that, which has always slightly terrified me. And that book, and I managed to do both of them. But yeah, it's a history of ideas approach, John Gunn in the context of the Enlightenment. But what he does is think very logically about everything. And the first word of his cello method is something like science. And the first word of a book he wrote about the flute was, I think, philosophy. I may have got that the wrong way around, but you get the idea, know. And that fascinated me. And he went into it, because he was thinking about these things in detail for the first time ever. People like Duport are writing a practical book. Duport is much more use, frankly, than John Gunn. But Duport is writing a practical book from the outset, how to do stuff, how to finger the cello, all that kind of thing. So is Romberg. Very pragmatic, very, realistic advice, that kind of thing. But Gunn is really going for the detail and where it comes from and all that kind of thing. So it's fascinating.
Boy, that does sound fascinating. All right. Now, I know for everybody out there, you need to go and look at George's entire output. It's really very vast and impressive. And as I was looking through it, I can see there's certain things strike me that if I were a musicologist as well as a cellist, I see how I would be drawn there.
Mm-hmm.
But like broadly, art and music, I'm curious sometimes for inspiration. One of the things I like to talk about on this series is motivation
Mm-hmm.
and inspiration. And sometimes it seems there's a particular young cellist, either maybe just at that time in their lives, for whom the thing that helps them get inspired the most is not necessarily finding the right recording to listen to or the right piece of repertoire, but it's one of the other arts. So it can be
Yes.
poetry, it can be dance, it can be theater or visual arts. So I'm just kind of curious how, like you say, which is, I think, very enviable, that you get to these days just go in your research wherever you want to go. But it's like, how
Yeah.
can you just, in a nutshell, give an idea of how you go for some very specific things in some cases and some very broad uh,
Mhm.
things in other cases? What leads you where you go?
Yeah. Actually, you've put your finger on something which I realized myself at some point. I go from really, really detailed stuff, to do with editions. I wrote an article about Haydn cello concertos, for instance, in 19th century editions. And that's really detailed publishing history and, fine things. And I go from that extreme on one hand to applications of Foucault's theory of discourse and interpretation of 19th century performing editions. And I have to say, and this is why I don't teach research methods, um, I have to say that chance plays such a big part of this. I'm interested in art and music. I always have been in a kind of general sort of way, nothing specific. But for my master's thesis at Leeds, I wrote a dissertation on the Lithuanian artist Mikalojus Čiurlionis, who lived end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and was equally active as a composer and an artist, which is quite unusual. He wrote about 300 pieces of music. He made about 300 odd paintings.
Hmm.
And I came across him because I was doing some pre-performance talks for my old opera company on Debussy's Pallias et Mélisande. And I was looking at the symbolist literature, and I came across a book about Russian art, which mentioned Čiurlionis. And when I was asked what dissertation topic I wanted to do, I mentioned a few rather predictable topics in 18th century editing. And then I said, I've come across this guy. He seems to be an artist and a composer. I haven't heard any of his music yet, but he looks interesting. And the person interviewing said, that sounds good. And in the end, I wrote my dissertation. I went to Lithuania, which I think is very important to do that kind of thing. I was introduced to all sorts of people, small country, obscure composer, foreigner comes in, interested, they just show you everything.
Uh,
Um, I gave a conference paper in Russia the following year, and that turned into my first academic publication about English attitudes towards Čiurlionis' art in
hmm.
the early 20th century. And as it happens, in October this year, I'm going to Lithuania again to speak 20 years later about Čiurlionis' reception in France up until the Second World War.
Wow.
And that's a topic people have been asking me to write about this for a while, and I finally thought, right, okay, I need to do this now. It's a decent conference paper topic. I don't think it's an article, but anyway. But I'm interested in that, and I'm also generally interested in the whole relationship between musicians and artists in 19th century England. Uh, there was a whole, it's not to do with does this painting look musical or does this piece of music sound like a painting? I think that's a rather dead-end approach. But looking at the practicalities, the conductor and pianist Sir Charles Halley, who founded the Halley Orchestra, he had an idea that he wanted to set up an academy of music where students would do music and art, you know, and that sort of idea is, I think, a very interesting one to trace. I think that's on my list of things to do. But I think it is fascinating because there are ways of talking about art and music. I wrote something recently about one of the pre-Raphaelite artists, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and his painting and poem on the same topic, La Demoiselle, La Demoiselle Élue, which was set to music by Debussy. And I wrote an article about that for a journal a couple of years ago, which seemed to go quite well. So yes, there are overlaps which are quite interesting. I think it's quite And it's a relatively open area as well. There's not so much work. I mean, everyone knows that Paul Clay, for instance, was a violinist who played second violin in a Swiss orchestra, and he had musical titles for his paintings sometimes as well, you know. But there's more to it than that, I think. Yeah.
Well, and part of Casal's early instruction was also to go to the various museums and look at the great works of art, wasn't it? Yeah,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Funnily enough, I'm editing a book with about 13 other contributors right now called well, I think it's going to be called The Romantic Cello. It's due out next year from Brepols. And my chapter in that book is about similarities. I don't say influences exactly, because Casals wasn't really interested in modern art at all, and he certainly wasn't interested in Picasso. But nonetheless, there are things in his performances and also in his writing in the Alexanian traité, you know, the book Alexanian wrote about playing the cello. That suggested to me that his place in relationship to modernism was slightly more complicated than people might think now. Um, and I'm talking about him partly in connection with aspects of Picasso's early art that moved towards Cubism. It's a highly speculative piece, and I think it should come with a health warning. But it's been annoying me for quite a long time, so I decided to just write it for this. Yeah, but yes, yeah, Casals. I think yes. There was a great violinist in Sheffield, in the north of England, Peter Cropper, who led the Lindsay Quartet, which was in its day a very famous quartet. Um, he was supposed to be giving a master class somewhere, I can't remember where, and he had all these earnest students, hyper focused on technique and playing their instrument as well as they possibly could, you know, and spending hours and hours and hours practicing. And he took them out to a museum and said, you know, look at this stuff, you know, it's good for you. Uh, you know, it'll give you ideas. It'll make you a more rounded, more educated person, you know. So I think it's quite a common thing. Yeah.
That's great. All right. One more question. What is your connection with the website with the bad pun I wish I'd thought of Cello Sorcery, Sourcery?
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's terrific. When I knew you were going to be interviewing me, I asked around because the kind of websites that I use are purely for research. So, you know, no one wants to know about the German newspaper portal or, you know, that kind of thing. But I asked a good friend of mine here, I'm in Amsterdam right now. I asked a good friend of mine, Job ter Haar, who's a fantastic cellist and a great teacher, teaches in Bern in Switzerland, and I think still in Rotterdam as well. And he said, it's a good thing you asked me because I've just started this website. And Cello Sorcery, is it's a really lively introduction for anyone who's interested into 19th century performance practices, you know, different bowing techniques, different approaches to things like portamento, for instance, different approaches to vibrato, all the basic stuff, which, and frankly, as soon as he sent me the link, as soon as I thought, I wish I'd done that myself 10 years ago. But he does it far better than I would have done it. So I think that's a really interesting website to look at, and it's constantly in development as well. So, you know, I think there's always going to be something new there. And I'd recommend people to check it out because Job and a colleague of his who I don't know so well, they talk so interestingly and enthusiastically about all these kind of things.
Yeah.
And it is a big topic these days. I mean, here in Amsterdam and in Rotterdam, people are really interested in 19th century performance practices. There's one thing I wanted to say, which I forgot to say, and I think I'm partly responsible for this, and I feel quite pleased about it. It's always about, you know, the expression historical performance practice in the singular.
Right.
It's
Practice.
always a plural. It's always a plural because, uh, say you're a cellist and you live in Germany in 1850. If you live in a nice big city with a lot of good music shops, you will have access to Bernhard Romberg's violoncelle school, which came out in 1840. So that'll be in the shops. You might still get access to Dupont. You might possibly, if you move quickly, you might pick up Kummer's cello method. But if you lived in some tiny little place, some isolated village on the banks of the Baltic, then you could be learning from a French cello method from 1770. And so it's always practices. There are always people who are fully up to date with the latest thing, people who are not. And when you come to talk about what is historical performance practice, you really have to deal with that question because it's never one thing. It'd be different in the next city.
Very good point.
So I think that's quite important. And whenever I hear someone talk about practices in the plural, I feel very quietly just a little bit pleased with myself because of that, because I've been banging on about that for at least 20 years.
All right, bravo. All right, so you've actually mentioned some of these already throughout the interview, but I'm wondering, as prolific as you are, you probably have several irons in the fire. What are some of the other things that you have coming down the pike in the rest of 2020
Yeah.
2026?
Yeah, well, this book I'm editing, The Romantic Cello, I think we might call it that. That's one thing. I also have my own book. I've written a book about a Berlin cellist from the late 19th, early 20th century, died in 1931, born in 1855, Heinrich Grünfeld. He was very famous in Berlin as a chamber musician. He was in all the papers, but he was famous for two things. One was playing chamber music, and the other was telling jokes. And when he died, every obituary described him as, it would say something like Heinrich Grünfeld, Violoncellist und Causeur, ist gestorben. And his jokes would be repeated in the newspapers over and over again. He toured America. He went on tour to Russia. He went on tour to Turkey to play to the then Sultan of Turkey. He toured Eastern Europe, Netherlands, never went to Britain for some reason, but everywhere else. And he wrote his memoirs. That was the crucial thing. He wrote his memoirs in 1923, which have never been translated and are not available digitally either. But I have a copy. And I translated it in my spare time, just as a sort of part-time hobby. And then I thought I need to write an introduction. And the whole thing is now pushing close to 100,000 words. And I've just pitched it to a publisher, but I haven't heard anything back, and I'm not going to talk about the publisher. But I think it's bad luck. But that, I suppose, might, if I'm very lucky, they'll bite and say, yes, please, we want this. Is putting him in his context and showing how, and this is the really important thing, how a musician who was not a great virtuoso, but was pretty good, created his own network in Berlin before the First World War and knew every Kaiser in his lifetime and knew every important politician, banker, artist, actor, playwright, everyone. And he mentions all these people in his memoirs. You don't get a description by Heinrich Grünfeld about how to hold the cello bow, but you do get a very good lesson in how to promote yourself and make friends, which I think is quite a charming thing. And I have another article coming out fairly soon in a Polish journal about an extraordinary arrangement of Corelli's Folia variations by the Belgian violinist César Thompson from the early 20th century, which rewrites the whole piece as if it was a sort of verismo opera and creates its own story and narrative and recomposes the whole piece. And that's quite hilarious. I enjoyed that writing that very much, and actually, that's something I have to take care of some little edits on that in the next couple of weeks. So there is all that, you know.
Wow.
I, it has been suggested to me, and I still think about it, that I should write a book about Casals, but basically, Casals's 10 most, Casals's life, as it were, in 10 recordings, you know, and just discuss each one in some detail and go off at a tangent with each one. It's an approach that's worked very well with a lot of books recently, but which reach a wide audience as well. Beethoven in ten episodes, that kind of thing. So that's an idea at the back of my mind. I'm still not sure how to write it, but yeah.
Wow. Well, I look forward to trying to follow all of this. And more power to you, though you clearly don't need it. Thanks so much, Dr.
Well,
Kennaway.
thank you very much.
It's been
It's been a great pleasure.
wonderful visiting with you. And I'm very
Yeah.
anxious to. It's very fun for me afterwards to pick my students' brain and see what they're inspired to look further into or consider pursuing
Mhm.
more themselves. So yeah, thank you so much. And to those of you out there watching, we'll see you the same time next Friday. Take care.
You had me at